For 3 years, she hadn't said a single word. The nurses had given up. Her own son had stopped visiting. Evelyn Whitfield sat in her wheelchair by the window of a Knoxville nursing home, watching the world move on without her, invisible, silent, already forgotten. Then one October afternoon, a Harley-Davidson rumbled into the parking lot, and a man covered in tattoos, wearing the unmistakable skull patch of the Hells Angels, walked through the front door. Every staff member reached for a phone, every visitor stepped back, but this man did something nobody expected. He pulled a chair beside her and sat down. And what happened next left an entire facility questioning everything they thought they knew about who deserves to be heard. The hallway of Briarwood Senior Living smelled like industrial disinfectant and microwaved mashed potatoes. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant tuneless song above the linoleum floors, casting a yellowish pallor over everything they touched. Nurses moved in efficient clusters, their sneakers squeaking against the tile, clipboards pressed to their chests like shields against the slow tide of decline that filled every room. In the sunroom, at the end of the east corridor, positioned in a wheelchair near the window, where the morning light fell in pale rectangles across her lap, sat Evelyn Whitfield. She was 82 years old, with hair the color of fresh snow pulled back in a loose bun, and hands that rested on the armrests of her chair like two small birds that had forgotten how to fly. Her eyes, a faded blue that still held the ghost of something sharp, were fixed on the parking lot beyond the glass, watching cars arrive and leave without any visible reaction. Nobody spoke to Evelyn anymore. Not really. The aides would greet her in that bright, exaggerated tone reserved for people they had already decided could not understand them. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn. Beautiful day, isn't it?" They never waited for an answer. They had stopped waiting 3 years ago, when the last word anyone could remember hearing from her lips was a single, quiet no, spoken to a nurse who had tried to change the channel from a nature documentary to a game show. After that, silence, complete and unbroken, like a door that had been shut from the inside and locked. Her medical chart told a clinical story. Patient presence with selective mutism, likely secondary to progressive cognitive decline and depressive affect. Recommend continued observation. Dr. Newell, the facility physician, had written those words 18 months ago during a routine evaluation that lasted less than 7 minutes. He had not revisited the assessment since. The staff at Briarwood had their own interpretation, spoken in break rooms and whispered during shift changes. "She's gone," they would say, tapping their temples with a knowing look. "The lights are on, but nobody's home." It was easier that way, easier to categorize Evelyn as a body that needed feeding, bathing, and repositioning every 2 hours than to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that she was still entirely present behind those quiet blue eyes, choosing silence because no one had given her a reason to speak. Patricia Doyle, the day shift supervisor, was a woman of 53 with sensible shoes and a lanyard that held 17 keys to 17 locked doors. She ran Briarwood with the precision of a factory foreman, and she had developed over her 21 years in elder care an almost surgical ability to categorize residents into those who required attention and those who could be managed on autopilot. Evelyn had been firmly in the second category for as long as Patricia could remember. "She eats when you put food in front of her," Patricia once explained to a new hire who had asked about the silent woman by the window. "She lets you bathe her, dress her, wheel her to activities. She just doesn't talk. Some of them get like that. Don't take it personally." What Patricia did not mention because she did not know was that Evelyn Whitfield had once been a woman of remarkable voice. Before Briarwood, before the fall that broke her hip and the son who decided she could no longer live alone, Evelyn had been a high school English teacher in Maryville for 34 years. She had taught Steinbeck and Dickinson and Baldwin to teenagers who rolled their eyes at first and cried at graduation. She had directed school plays, organized poetry readings at the public library, and written letters to the editor of the Knoxville News-Sentinel that were sharp enough to draw responses from city council members. But that was before. Before the fall, before the nursing home, before her son Craig stopped visiting after the first 6 months because the silence made him uncomfortable and the guilt made him angry. Before the world decided that Evelyn Whitfield was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. Now she sat by the window, watching the parking lot, and the staff moved around her like water flowing past a stone in a riverbed, acknowledging her presence only as something to navigate around. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything changed. The maple trees along Kingston Pike had turned the color of rust and flame, and a cold front had swept down from the Smoky Mountains overnight, dropping the temperature into the low 40s. Inside Briarwood, the heating system clanked and groaned its way to life, filling the hallways with dry, stale warmth. Evelyn was in her usual spot by the window when she heard it, the deep, guttural rumble of a motorcycle pulling into the parking lot. The sound cut through the facility's ambient hum like a knife through cloth, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Evelyn turned her head. Not the slow, unfocused drift of her usual movements, but a sharp, deliberate turn toward the sound, her faded blue eyes suddenly focused with an intensity that would have startled anyone who was paying attention. But no one was paying attention to Evelyn Whitfield. They were all looking at the man who had just walked through the front door. Dwight Hargrove stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 230 pounds, most of it concentrated in shoulders that looked like they had been designed for the specific purpose of filling door frames. His beard was thick and streaked with grey. His arms were covered from wrist to shoulder in tattoos that told stories only he could read, and his leather vest bore the unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, the winged death's head that had been making people cross to the other side of the street for decades. He stood in the lobby of Briarwood Senior Living, helmet under one arm, and every conversation within 30 feet stopped simultaneously. The receptionist, a young woman named Amber Felton, felt her hand move instinctively toward the phone on her desk. Not to call anyone specific, just to have something between her and this man who looked like he had been sent by Central Casting to play the villain in every movie she had ever seen. "Can I help you?" she asked, and the brightness in her voice was the kind that comes from fear disguised as professionalism. "I'm here to see my mother," Dwight said. His voice was lower than she expected and quieter. "Shirley Hargrove, room 114. Amber blinked. She knew Shirley Hargrove, a sweet, round-faced woman of 79 who did watercolors in the activity room and called everyone Sugar. The idea that this man was her son required a complete reorganization of Amber's understanding of genetics. "Of course," she said, sliding the visitor log across the counter. "Just sign in, please." Dwight signed his name in handwriting that was surprisingly neat and clipped the visitor badge to his vest, where it sat like a postage stamp on the side of a freight train. He walked down the corridor with the measured pace of someone who was used to being watched, who had long ago stopped being surprised by the way people pressed themselves against walls as he passed, the way conversations died and resumed in his wake like grass flattened by a passing truck. Patricia Doyle intercepted him at the junction of the east and west corridors. She had been alerted by Amber's discreet radio call. "We have a visitor. He's large," and she positioned herself in the hallway with the practiced authority of a woman who had once physically restrained a combative resident twice her size. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, and the way she said it made it clear she had already pulled his mother's file and read every emergency contact entry. "Your mother is in the activity room right now. I can take you there." "I know where it is," Dwight said. "I've been here before." He had been here before, twice in fact, over the 6 months since his mother had been admitted following her second stroke. Both times, he had come during off-peak hours, when the hallways were empty and he could sit with her without the weight of every eye in the building pressing down on him. But today was different. Today, his work schedule had forced him to come during the middle of the afternoon, and the facility was fully alive with staff, visitors, and the slow choreography of institutional care. Patricia walked half a step behind him, close enough to respond if something happened, far enough to maintain the fiction that she was simply heading in the same direction. Dwight noticed. He always noticed. 27 years wearing the patch had given him a sixth sense for the specific quality of attention that came from people who had already decided what he was. He found his mother in the activity room, seated at a table with 3 other women, painting a cardinal on a branch. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she raised both hands in a gesture of pure, uncomplicated joy. "Dwight! Oh, sugar, you came!" He bent down and kissed her forehead, and for a moment the room saw something that did not compute. This enormous tattooed man with a skull on his back, pressing his lips gently to an old woman's head while she patted his cheek with a paint-stained hand. "I brought you those cookies you like," he said, pulling a tin from the saddlebag he had slung over his shoulder, "the ones from McKay's bakery." "You are too good to me," Shirley said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They talked for 40 minutes. He listened to her describe her painting, admired the colors she had chosen, asked about her physical therapy, and helped her rearrange the photographs on her nightstand when they moved to her room. He refilled her water pitcher, adjusted the angle of her reading lamp, and made sure the television remote was within reach. When visiting hours began to wind down, Dwight kissed his mother goodbye and walked back toward the lobby. But instead of heading straight for the exit, he paused at the entrance to the sunroom. Something had caught his eye, or rather, someone. Evelyn Whitfield sat in her wheelchair by the window, bathed in the amber light of the late afternoon sun, and she was looking directly at him, not with the vacant, unfocused gaze that the staff had come to expect from her, but with clear, sharp eyes that held a question he could not identify, but could not ignore. He stood there for a moment, caught in the unexpected gravity of her attention. Then, because Dwight Hargrove had spent his entire life being the person that everyone else walked past, he did something that no one at Briarwood had thought to do in years. He walked into the sunroom, pulled a chair next to Evelyn's wheelchair, and sat down. "Hey," he said simply, "I'm Dwight." The silence that followed Dwight's introduction was not the awkward, uncomfortable kind that most people rush to fill. It was the deep, considered silence of 2 people taking each other's measure, each recognizing in the other something that the rest of the world had chosen not to see. Dwight did not rush to fill it. That was the first thing that made him different from every aide, nurse, volunteer, and family member who had tried and failed to engage Evelyn over the past 3 years. They had all arrived with their voices pitched high and their patience pre-measured, armed with questions designed to extract responses. "How are we feeling today? Would you like to watch television? Isn't the weather nice?" They treated conversation like a transaction, and when Evelyn refused to pay, they moved on to customers who would. Dwight simply sat. He looked out the window at the same parking lot Evelyn had been watching, and he breathed. And he waited. Not waited for her to speak, waited the way you wait for rain or for a season to change, with patience that had no deadline. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Patricia Doyle appeared at the doorway, saw Dwight sitting beside Evelyn, and felt a small earthquake of concern rumble through her professional composure. She opened her mouth to intervene, then closed it. He was not touching the resident. He was not agitating her. He was simply sitting. But every instinct Patricia had developed over 2 decades told her that this was wrong, that men who looked like Dwight Hargrove did not sit quietly beside elderly women in nursing homes without some ulterior motive that she could not yet identify. She made a mental note to check on the situation in 15 minutes and retreated to the nursing station. In the sunroom, Dwight finally spoke again. Not to Evelyn directly, but in her direction, the way a person might speak to a cat that had wandered onto their porch. "My mum's here," he said. "Shirley, down the hall. She had a couple of strokes. Can't move her left side much anymore, but she still paints. She's stubborn like that." He paused. "I guess we all are in our own way." Evelyn did not respond, but something shifted in her posture, a slight loosening of the rigid way she held her shoulders, a barely perceptible tilt of her head in his direction. "People look at me, and they see the vest," Dwight continued, his voice low and even. "They see the patches, the tattoos, the bike. They make up a whole story about who I am before I've said a single word. You know what that's like? Having people decide you're dangerous before you've even opened your mouth?" He was not looking at her. He was looking at the window, at the reflection of the room behind them, at the way the fading light turned everything the color of old photographs. "I bet you do," he said quietly. The aide who came to wheel Evelyn to dinner at 5:30 found them sitting together in the dimming sunroom, neither one speaking, and later described the scene to her co-workers as creepy. The word spread through the staff like a virus. By the next morning, a version of the story had solidified that bore only a passing resemblance to reality. A Hell's Angel had cornered a helpless, mute old woman in the sunroom, and only the vigilance of the staff had prevented something terrible from happening. Dr. Newell was consulted. He reviewed Evelyn's chart, found no evidence of distress, and recommended continued monitoring. Patricia assigned an aide to do hourly checks on the sunroom whenever Dwight was in the building. Dwight came back 2 days later. He had not planned to return so soon. His usual schedule was one visit every 2 or 3 weeks, constrained by his job as a diesel mechanic at a truck repair shop off Alcoa Highway. But something about the old woman by the window had stayed with him, lodged in his chest like a splinter he could not reach. He visited his mother first, as always. They shared the cookies, and Shirley told him about the new puzzle she was working on, a 1,000-piece landscape of the Smoky Mountains. Then he walked to the sunroom. Evelyn was in her spot. When she saw him enter, her eyes tracked his movement across the room. Not the slow drift of diminished cognition, but the deliberate following of someone who was waiting for exactly this. He sat down. He pulled a small paperback from his jacket pocket, a worn copy of East of Eden that he had bought for 75 cents at a used bookstore on Gay Street, and he began to read. Not to her, not for her. He simply read, turning pages with thick fingers that were permanently stained with engine grease, sitting beside her in the warm silence of the sunroom while the October light moved across the floor. On page 43, without any preamble or warning, Evelyn Whitfield spoke. "Steinbeck," she said. The word came out rough and fractured, like a machine starting up after years of disuse, but it was unmistakable. One word, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who had taught that book to hundreds of teenagers over 3 decades. Dwight looked up from the page. He did not gasp, did not shout for a nurse, did not make a spectacle of the moment. He simply met her eyes and said, "Yeah, you know it?" The faintest trace of something crossed Evelyn's face, something that had been buried so deep and for so long that it had almost fossilized. It might have been a smile. "I taught it," she said. The news that Evelyn Whitfield had spoken spread through Briarwood Senior Living with the speed and distortion of a rumor in wartime. By the end of the day, 3 different versions were circulating. She had screamed, she had cried, she had spoken in tongues. The only consistent element was that the Hell's Angel had been present, and this fact was interpreted not as connection, but as cause for alarm. Patricia Doyle called an emergency staff meeting the following morning. 8 nurses and aides gathered in the conference room, clutching coffee cups and concern in equal measure. "Whatever happened in that sunroom, we need to make sure Mrs. Whitfield is not being subjected to any form of intimidation or coercion, Patricia said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Mr. Hargrove is a known member of an outlaw motorcycle gang. We have a duty of care. Sandra Pickens, a nurse who had worked the evening shift for 11 years and had the dark circles to prove it, raised her hand. She said a word, Patricia. One word. She hasn't spoken in 3 years, and she said a word. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe, Patricia conceded, but we need to consider why she spoke. Was it fear? Was it distress? She said Steinbeck, Sandra replied flatly. That doesn't sound like distress to me. The meeting ended without resolution, which is how most meetings at Briarwood ended. Patricia assigned Sandra to monitor the situation, partly because Sandra had advocated for a measured response, and partly because Patricia believed in giving people enough rope to prove her right. Dwight returned 3 days later. This time, he brought 2 copies of East of Eden, his battered paperback, and a large print edition he had ordered online. He set the large print copy on the arm of Evelyn's wheelchair without comment and opened his own. They read in parallel silence for 20 minutes. Then Evelyn spoke again. "Chapter 3, she said, "the Salinas Valley. That's where it starts to breathe." Dwight turned to Chapter 3. He read the opening paragraph aloud, his deep voice filling the sunroom with Steinbeck's description of the Long Valley and the Gabilan Mountains. And Evelyn closed her eyes and listened with an expression that Sandra Pickens, watching from the doorway, would later describe in her notes as peaceful. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Dwight came every 3 or 4 days, always visiting his mother first, then spending an hour in the sunroom with Evelyn. They read together. They talked, haltingly at first, then with increasing fluidity as Evelyn's voice strengthened and her trust deepened. She told him about teaching, about her students, about the way a well-constructed sentence could change the temperature of a room. He told her about motorcycles, about the brotherhood of the road, about how the club had given him a family when his own father walked out on his 9th birthday. The staff watched with a mixture of fascination and unease. The narrative they had constructed, dangerous man, vulnerable woman, kept colliding with the evidence of their own eyes, and the collision produced cognitive dissonance that expressed itself as increased surveillance. Patricia ordered background checks. The results confirmed what she already knew. Dwight Hargrove had a record, an assault charge from 1998, pled down to disorderly conduct, a DUI from 2003. Nothing in the past 20 years. He worked at Henderson Diesel Repair, paid his taxes, and had been visiting his mother regularly since her admission. The criminal history, thin as it was, gave Patricia enough justification to maintain her vigilance and her suspicion. What the background check did not reveal, because background checks are designed to catalogue failures, not measure character, was that Dwight Hargrove had been sober for 19 years. That he had spent every Thanksgiving for the past decade organizing a toy drive through the club for children in foster care. That he had held his best friend's hand in a hospital room in Sevierville while cancer took everything the man had, and that he had emerged from that room with an understanding of mortality that had reshaped every relationship he had since. The background check did not reveal that Dwight understood Evelyn's silence, because he carried his own version of it. The silence that comes from being so thoroughly prejudged that speaking feels pointless, because people have already decided what your words mean before you say them. It was during his 6th visit that the confrontation happened. Dwight was reading aloud from Of Mice and Men. They had moved on from East of Eden by mutual, largely non-verbal agreement when Craig Whitfield walked into the sunroom. Craig was 57, balding, and dressed in the business casual uniform of a regional insurance manager. He had not visited his mother in 4 months, and the guilt had been building in him like pressure in a sealed container. When he saw his mother, his silent, supposedly diminished mother, leaning toward a Hell's Angel who was reading to her from a paperback, the pressure found its release. "What is going on here?" Craig's voice cracked across the room like a branch breaking. "Who are you? What are you doing with my mother?" Dwight set the book down slowly. "I'm reading to her," he said. "I can see what you're doing. I want to know why. What do you want from her?" "She doesn't have money, if that's what you're thinking. She doesn't have anything." The words hung in the air, and Dwight saw something pass across Evelyn's face that he recognized instantly. The specific pain of hearing your own child declare you worthless as a defense strategy. "She doesn't have anything," Dwight repeated, and the way he said it turned Craig's statement into an accusation aimed back at its speaker. And then Evelyn spoke. Not a single word, not a fragment, but a full, clear, devastating sentence that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "I have everything I ever needed, Craig. You just never stayed long enough to see it." Craig Whitfield stood in the doorway of the sunroom at Briarwood Senior Living and heard his mother speak for the first time in 3 years, and the sound of her voice broke something open in him that he had spent years bricking shut. The aftermath of Evelyn's words moved through Briarwood like the aftershock of an earthquake, invisible but felt in every wall. Craig collapsed into a chair across from his mother and cried. Not the restrained, masculine crying of someone maintaining composure, but the raw, ugly sobbing of a man confronting the distance between who he believed himself to be and who he had actually been. Dwight stood, picked up his book, and walked quietly out of the sunroom. Some moments belonged to other people, and he had spent enough years in rooms full of hard emotions to know when his presence was a gift and when it was an intrusion. He found Sandra Pickens at the nursing station. She was pretending to update charts, but her eyes were red, and her pen had not moved in several minutes. "You heard?" Dwight asked. "These walls are thin," Sandra said. She looked up at him, really looked the way people rarely did, and said, "You know, when you first came in here, I thought Patricia was right. I thought you were going to be a problem. And now? Now, I think we were the problem. All of us." It was the most honest thing anyone at Briarwood had said in years, and Dwight received it with a nod that carried more weight than any speech could have. Over the days that followed, the facility underwent a slow, tectonic shift in perception. Sandra wrote a detailed report about Evelyn's recovery of speech, attributing it directly to the consistent, unpressured social engagement provided by Dwight's visits. She submitted the report to Patricia, who read it twice, set it down on her desk, and stared at it for a long time. Patricia Doyle had spent 21 years in elder care building systems designed to protect vulnerable people from harm. Those systems were good systems, necessary systems. But somewhere along the way, the systems had become walls, and the walls had become so high that she could no longer see over them to the human beings on the other side. She had looked at Dwight Hargrove and seen a threat because her systems told her that men with criminal records and motorcycle gang affiliations were threats. She had looked at Evelyn Whitfield and seen a declining patient because her systems told her that elderly women who stopped speaking were declining. Both assessments were efficient, evidence-based, and completely wrong. She found Dwight in the parking lot after his next visit, standing beside his motorcycle, fastening his helmet strap. The Harley-Davidson Road King gleamed black and chrome in the November sunlight, and Patricia had to resist the instinct to keep a safe distance. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, and something in her voice was different. The institutional authority was still there, but it had been joined by something more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology." Dwight paused, his hands still on the helmet strap. He had heard apologies before. Most of them came with conditions, caveats, fine print. He waited to see what kind this was. "I judged you," Patricia continued. "I looked at you and I decided who you were. And I was wrong. I made assumptions about your intentions that were based entirely on your appearance, and those assumptions almost prevented something meaningful from happening for one of my residents. That's on me." Dwight considered her for a moment. Then he said, "You were doing your job. You were trying to protect her." "I was trying to protect myself," Patricia said, "from being wrong about the things I think I know." It was an admission that cost her something, and Dwight understood the currency of that cost. He extended his hand, and Patricia shook it, and the gesture carried the weight of two people choosing to see each other clearly for the first time. Greg Whitfield began visiting his mother every Sunday. The first few visits were stiff, heavy with guilt and the effort of reconnection, but Evelyn, whose voice grew stronger each week, fed by conversation and attention and the simple, nourishing fact of being heard, met him with a patience that was fiercer than any anger could have been. She did not forgive him because forgiveness implies a transaction, and Evelyn was done with transactions. She simply kept the door open and waited for him to walk through it. Dwight and Evelyn continued their reading sessions. They finished Of Mice and Men and moved on to Baldwin, then to Morrison, then to a collection of poetry by Mary Oliver that Dwight had found at the same used bookstore on Gay Street. He read the poems aloud, his rough voice softening around the edges of the language, and Evelyn would sometimes close her eyes and recite lines from memory that she had not accessed in years. Passages that rose up from the deep wells of her mind, like water that had always been there, waiting for someone to lower the bucket. The other residents began to notice. They saw the big man in the leather vest sitting beside the small woman in the wheelchair, and at first they kept their distance. But curiosity is stronger than fear when fear is not being actively fed, and gradually, tentatively, they began to approach. Dwight found himself reading to an audience of 4, then 6, then 10. He recruited his mother, who brought her watercolors, and soon the sunroom became something it had never been during Patricia's tenure, a place where people actually wanted to be. Sandra Pickens presented the case at a regional elder care conference in Nashville the following spring. Her presentation was titled Beyond the Chart: Rethinking Assumptions in Residential Care, and it focused on how institutional biases about patients, about visitors, about what decline looks like and what recovery requires, can become self-fulfilling prophecies that trap people in categories they never chose. She did not use Dwight's name or Evelyn's, but everyone in the room understood that the story was real, and several people cried, and one administrator from a facility in Chattanooga stood up during the question period and said, "We've been doing this wrong. We've been looking at people through our charts instead of our eyes." On a warm afternoon in April, 7 months after Dwight first sat down beside her, Evelyn Whitfield asked him a question that she had been holding for weeks. "Why did you sit down that day? You didn't know me. You had no reason to stop." Dwight thought about it. The sunroom was full of light, and his mother was at the table behind them painting a bluebird, and Craig was due to arrive in an hour, and the world outside the window was green and alive in the way that East Tennessee becomes in spring, as if the mountains themselves are exhaling after holding their breath through winter. "Because I know what it looks like," he said finally, "when the whole world has decided you're not worth talking to, and I know what it costs. I figured if I could sit with someone in that place, really sit, not just pass through, then maybe neither of us had to be there alone." Evelyn reached over and placed her hand on his. Her hand was small and spotted with age, and his was large and dark, with decades of engine grease that never fully washed away. And together they looked like a photograph of everything the world gets wrong about people and everything it could get right if it stopped looking at the surface and started looking at the soul. "You gave me my voice back," she said. "No," Dwight said. "You never lost it. Everyone else just stopped listening." Outside, the motorcycle sat in the parking lot beside a row of sensible sedans, and the Hells Angels insignia on Dwight's vest caught the afternoon sun. And somewhere inside Briarwood Senior Living, an old woman was laughing for the first time in years, and the sound of it traveled down the hallway and through the walls and into the hearts of everyone who heard it, reminding them, if they were willing to be reminded, that the people we dismiss and the people we fear are often the very people we need the most.